Socrates stands at the fault line where Greek intellectual life pivoted from cosmology towards the human order: how to live, how to judge, how to reason, how to face death, and what a city owes its citizens, or demands from them. He is also, paradoxically, one of the most recoverable figures in the history of philosophy. The name Socrates functions less like a stable historical person and more like a contested symbol, a moral provocateur, a method, a martyr, a teacher, a public nuisance, a saint of rational inquiry, and to his enemies, a corrosive influence on the civic order. The resulting tension between the enormous influence attributed to him and the thin contradictory evidence for what he actually believed is not an accidental footnote. It is the central imperative fact about Socrates and a major reason he remains intellectually alive. The most basic obstacle is that Socrates wrote nothing. The absence is not just a biographical detail, it shapes everything about the tradition. What we call the Socratic philosophy is in practice an inheritance mediated through others, above all Plato and Xenophon, supplemented by the satirical portrait in Aristophanes and the later philosophical testimony of Aristotle. Each of these sources has a different agenda, a different genre, and a different relationship to the mind. Plato writes philosophical dialogues dramat- whose dramatic Socrates is often a vehicle for argument. Xenophon writes as a soldier and moralist defending his teacher. Aristophanes caricatures a Socrates for comedic and political effect. Aristotle reports selectively, often filtered through his own conceptual architecture and his reading of Plato. When you put these together, you do not get a single coherent portrait, you get a problem, the Socratic problem. The enduring difficulty of separating the historical Socrates from the literary and philosophical reconstruction built on his name. The problem is not scholarly pedantry. If you cannot reliably locate what Socrates believed, then Socrates becomes a movable foundation on which later thinkers built incompatible structures. That is exactly what happened. Ancient schools as different as Cynicism and Stoicism, and later tradition as different as Christian moralization and Enlightenment rationalism, claimed Socrates as an ancestor. Modern philosophers then refight the question: was Socrates primarily an ethical thinker, an ironist, a proto-liberal conscience, an elite critic of democracy, or the father of a rationalism that later became culturally dominant and oppressive? The figure persists because he is simultaneously specific, an Athenian executed in 399 BCE, and plastic, a contextual template that thinkers can reshape to reflect their own anxieties and ideals. Even with sources closest to him, the portrayal is unstable. Plato's dialogue range from early texts, which Socrates appears as a relentless questioner who ends in puzzlement. No later works where the same character articulates a large metaphysical vision. A common interpretive strategy is to distinguish an early Socratic phase in Plato, more focused on ethics and reputation, from a later Platonic phase in which Socrates increasingly becomes Plato's mouthpiece. But this strategy itself contested but this strategy is itself contested because it depends on distributed chronology and on contested assumptions about Plato's intentions. Xenophon, meanwhile, often presents a Socrates who is more significantly straightforward, edifying, more dictated, less philosophically radical, less committed to the kind of epistemic self-undoing that the Platonic Socrates performs. Aristophanes adds another layer: a Socrates who looks like a Sophonist or natural philosopher, an absurd intellectual who teaches people rhetorical trickery and irrelevance. The upshot is not that we know nothing, but that our language is structurally uncertain, and uncertainty is a part of Socratic legacy. Against that background, the most influential Socratic contribution is less a doctrine than a practice. The method of questioning, commonly called the Socratic method or Elenchus. In Plato's early dialogues, Socrates typically approaches someone reputed to know about pity, courage, justice, moderation, virtue, and asks for a definition. The definition is then tested through short question and answers. The interlocutor commits to implications, accepts example, grants small premises, and eventually finds commitments conflict. The view collapses into contradiction or confusion. Often the dialogue ends not with a final answer but with aporia, an impasse in which the participants realize that their thought and what they understood was not understood at all. This is both intellectually aggressive and psychologically destabilizing. It treats confident speech as suspects until it survives examination, and it treats examination as an ethical duty rather a merely academic exercise. The LNCHS is frequently misrepresented as a mere debating tactic. In a shadow reading, Socrates wins by trapping people. In a deeper reading, he is exposing something structural about human cognition and social life, that reputation, authority, and fluency are poor substitute for actual understanding, and that moral talk is often inherent and unexamined, and that the first step towards wisdom is to become suspicious of your own certainty. And this is why the demand for definition matters. Socrates repeatedly insisted that before we argue what is just or courageous, we must know what courage is. If we cannot say what the thing is, then we are fighting with shadows. The insistence is methodical, but also political and ethical. It challenges the city rhetorical economy where prestige and persuasion can dominate over clarity and truth. Yet, even here the tradition splits. Some interpreters hold that Elenchus is primarily destructive. It does not establish truth, it only reveals inconsistency in someone's belief. On this view, the method is a tool for negative knowledge, knowing that certain claims cannot be held together, not a machine for producing positive theory. Other argues that method can be constructive, guiding interculus towards better beliefs only if it is indirect. The dispute is not trivial. If Socrates is merely a refuter, then his legacy is skepticism and intellectual hygiene. If Socrates is a constructive seeker, then his legacy introduces substantial ethical commitments achieved through disciplinary inquiry. Plato's texts provide evidence for both readings because they depict both of them as relentless refutation and moments where Socrates seems confident that certain moral conclusions are also scarce. The tension is also visible in the most famous theme of Socratic ignorance. Socrates is repeatedly associated with the claim that he knows that he doesn't know. In the most influential framing, Socrates is wiser than others because he recognizes his own ignorance, whereas others are ignorant about believing themselves wise. This humility is often romanticized, but in the dialogue, not in reality. It is an epistemic weapon. By disclaiming knowledge, Socrates refuses to compete on standard currency of authority. He forces the conversation back to reasons. At the same time, he claims this claim creates problems. Socrates often speaks as if he doesn't know certain things, especially that injustice is harmful or that it is shameful to do wrong. He appears sometimes to have moral certainty while professing ignorance about virtue essence. Religion in the Socratic picture is equally disruptive. Socrates is prosecuted for impiety, yet the sources often portray him believing in the divine, though in although in a non-conformist way. He challenges anthropomorphic stories that depicts God as morally corrupt. He reframes piety away from transactional sacrifice and towards rational inquiry and self-examination. The eutho- euphoric dilemma where the good is good because the gods love it, or the gods love it because it is good, captures the soft core morally. Morality cannot be reduced to divine command if the gods themselves are to be understood as just. In this sense, Socrates relocates authority not just from gods, but from humans in a simplistic manner. Such a move is both philosophical and politically dangerous in a city where civic region is bound up with civic identity. The political dimensions of Socrates is difficult precisely because his methods is inherently political even when he avoids office. He interrogates the citizens who claim authority, expertise, and virtue. He thereby threatens status structures grounded in reputation rather than demonstrable knowledge. His critique of rhetoric and mass persuasion can be read as anti-democratic insofar as he distrusts the competence of the many and exposes how public opinion can be manipulated. Yet his stance can also be read as moralization of democracy, a demand that citizens not outsource judgment to demagogues, and that civic life be guided by reasonable accountability. At the same time, the Socratic problem ensures that Socrates remain contested because the sources are literary and biased. The figure is permanently open to interpretation. The openness is not a weakness of tradition, it is a part of energy. Socrates survives not because he possesses the system, but because the inherently unresolved challenge to justify others' belief under questioning, to clarify our terms, to face the possibility that our moral confidence is unsupported, and to decide whether a life devoted to examination is worth the social risk it carries. In that sense, Socrates is less a set of answers than a standing demand, an institutionalized pressure on complacency, whose force can be felt whenever a person or society is compelled to give reasons instead of slogans. What makes Socrates enduring in his way is his life and his death diffuse methods. Ethics and politics is one narrative. The Socratic method is not merely a classroom technique. It is a form of public accountability that undermines prestige without an argument. Socratic ethics is not mere moralizing. It is a claim that the health of the soul matters more than external success. Socrates' politics is not partly ideological. It is the insistence that civic life cannot be legitimate if it rests on unexamined assumptions and rhetorical manipulation. His trial then tests these commitments under maximum pressure. The city in executing him becomes the stage on which the costs of free inquiry are made visible. Socrates becomes the emblem of a question that never expires. How much truth telling and critical interrogation can a society tolerate before it treats philosophy as subversion?